The clinking of polished silverware against fine china filled the air, accompanied by the low hum of conversations that floated through the restaurant. Laughter broke out intermittently, a sound that punctuated the otherwise smooth ambience. Monroe's Prime wasn't just a high-end steakhouse. It was a display of power and wealth, a place where those who could afford it came to flaunt their status. The elegant atmosphere was palpable. Crystal chandeliers overhead bathed the room in a warm, golden glow, casting reflections over pristine tables draped in white linen. Every inch of the place screamed exclusivity. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a performance, and the wealthy were its audience, actors and critics. In the corner booth Saturday Richard Sterling, a man whose presence dominated the space. He leaned back in his seat, his custom-tailored suit hiding his frame perfectly. His Rolex gleamed in the light, its gold reflecting power, and he swirled a glass of deep red wine as if savoring the moment. Everything about him screamed authority, his posture, his movements, even the way people instinctively stepped aside when he passed. Richard didn't just exist in spaces, he commanded them. He was a man who made things happen, a venture capitalist with ruthless precision. No one ever told him no, and if they did, he made sure they regretted it. Ava Monroe, on the other hand, moved like a ghost through the space. She weaved through the tables with practiced grace, balancing trays with ease as she served the guests. For nearly 3 years, Ava had worked at Monroe's Prime, and in that time, she had learned the rules of the game. She knew which customers to engage with, those who might offer a kind word or an appreciative glance, and which ones to avoid. Like Richard Sterling, Ava wasn't concerned with recognition. She didn't crave attention. The work was hard, but it paid the bills. When she had moments to herself, in between the rush of orders and the endless demands of the night, she would let herself dream. She didn't dream of escaping her life. That wasn't her style. Ava was too grounded for that. Instead, she dreamed of her voice, a voice that could stop time, that could command a room, that could make people feel something deep and profound. But in Monroe's Prime, she was just a waitress, and for tonight, that was enough. Richard Sterling, however, had other plans. A venture capitalist with millions at his disposal, Richard had built his empire by making people feel small. He found enjoyment in watching others scramble, pushing them to their limits just to test their resolve. But tonight, he was in a particularly good mood. A recent business deal had fattened his pockets by another 8 figures, and to celebrate, he had invited a few of his associates to join him for dinner. They laughed loudly, too loudly, their voices rising above the usual murmur of the restaurant. The waitstaff moved swiftly, ensuring that every drink was refilled before it could be emptied, and that no plate was left sitting too long. After all, no one wanted to deal with Richard's temper. Ava approached with the next round of drinks, setting them down one by one without interrupting their conversation. She knew better than to engage men like Richard. They either ignored her entirely or looked at her as though she were a passing novelty. But tonight, Richard noticed her. "Hey, sweetheart," Richard's voice called out, smooth but with an undercurrent of something more, something calculated. He had stopped her mid-step. His companions at the table smirked, knowing full well what was happening. Ava turned, her expression neutral. "Yes, sir." Richard studied her for a moment, tilting his head, as if deciding whether she was worth his attention. "You've been quiet all night. No small talk. What? You don't like serving people like us?" A few chuckles rippled through the table. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a challenge meant to establish power. "I'm just doing my job, sir," Ava replied evenly, her voice calm, steady, and focused on the task at hand. Richard leaned back, clearly enjoying himself. Focused, huh? He took a slow sip from his glass, letting the silence stretch between them before finally breaking it with a grin. "You know what? I think we need some entertainment. How about you sing for us?" The words fell into the room like a slap, heavy and shocking. Ava blinked, her fingers tightening around the tray. The laughter around the table grew louder, and the nearby diners began to glance over, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, but none dared speak up. Richard's grin widened as he egged her on. "Come on, don't look so serious. I'm sure you've got some kind of talent, or is it just carrying plates?" Ava could feel every eye in the room on her. The staff behind the bar had gone still, the hostess by the entrance nervously shifting on her feet. Everyone watched, waiting for something to happen. No one spoke out, no one ever did, but tonight silence was not an option. Ava had been pushed too far. The restaurant had fallen into an uncomfortable hush. The only sound was the soft shuffle of footsteps as Ava tried to compose herself. Her mind raced, her pulse quickening as Richard's challenge hung in the air. She could feel every set of eyes on her now, some in amusement, others with expectation, and some with a subtle hint of discomfort, but there was no escaping it. Richard had made his demand clear. This wasn't about her voice or talent. It was about control, about asserting dominance in front of his colleagues. The tables were set, the audience ready, and she was the unwilling performer. Ava had worked in the service industry long enough to know when something was a power play. She had encountered customers who tried to belittle her, test her patience, or dismiss her as invisible. Richard Sterling was the kind of man who reveled in that. He had everything: wealth, status, influence, and yet it was never enough. He needed to see people like Ava, people who existed solely to serve. Brought low, his power was in their submission, and Ava knew that giving him what he wanted would be a mistake, a dangerous one. But Richard didn't give her the luxury of choosing. His eyes remained locked on hers, his grin wide, as if expecting her to comply without hesitation. The silence around them thickened, and she could feel the tension crawling up her spine. He was enjoying this. He was watching her, waiting for her to shrink, to falter. But Ava had learned it long ago, that those who sought to make her feel small could only succeed if she allowed it, and she wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. Ava exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "I'm just here to do my job, sir," she repeated, her voice firm, but her heart racing beneath the calm exterior. She had to stay composed, no matter how much Richard's presence loomed over her. But his smile only widened. "Oh, I'm sure you are," Richard replied smoothly, clearly enjoying the tension. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough for the table to hear, "but not for anyone else. But you know, sometimes a job is more than just serving food. It's about entertaining. How about it?" A few of his associates exchanged glances, their amusement obvious. They were waiting for her to crack, for her to perform some humiliating trick that would amuse them. This was about making her feel insignificant, to show her that in this world, her voice didn't matter. The whole restaurant was complicit in the game now, either silently rooting for her to fail or silently hoping for her to rise to the challenge. Ava hesitated, but only for a moment. She knew she couldn't let him dictate the terms of this situation. The silence was suffocating, but she refused to be the one to break into it. Her fingers gripped the tray harder, the silver of the drinks cool against her palms. She had a choice to make, but it wasn't the one Richard wanted her to make. It wasn't about refusing to sing or walking away from the table. It was about proving that she didn't need to perform to win. The softest note escaped her lips, barely audible at first, but the moment it did, the room seemed to hold its breath. The soft, deliberate note sent ripples through the air, and Ava felt a strange sense of control. She wasn't singing to please them. She wasn't doing this for Richard or his audience. She was doing it for herself. She wasn't going to let him reduce her to nothing more than a servant. In this moment, her voice had power. She wasn't just carrying trays. She wasn't just an object to be dismissed. Ava's voice grew stronger, filling the room as she sang. The melody was raw, genuine. It wasn't the kind of polished, rehearsed performance one would expect in a setting like this. No, this was something different. Her voice had depth, a quality that commanded attention. that shook the air around her. It was as if the room had ceased to exist beyond the sound of her singing. The laughter at the table, the conversations, the clinking of glasses, all of it faded. Only her voice remained. Richard's expression faltered for a fraction of a second. It wasn't much, but it was enough. His amusement shifted, replaced by something else, something he wasn't used to, feeling discomfort. He had expected mockery, ridicule, something to laugh about with his colleagues. But what he got was something unexpected, something that made him question the game he had so carefully set up. His associates were silent now. The room had gone still. The diners frowned in place, caught in the rawness of what they were witnessing. The quiet strength of Ava's voice filled the restaurant, not as a performance, but as a declaration. She wasn't a servant. She wasn't there to be controlled or diminished. She was there, and she was making her presence known. For a brief moment, Richard thought he could laugh it off. He could dismiss it, pretend it hadn't happened. But the applause that followed Ava's last note came so suddenly, so organically, that he was taken aback. It wasn't polite or forced. It wasn't some empty applause meant to appease her. No, this was real. It was genuine. The room erupted, people clapping, whistling, some even standing in their seats. They weren't just impressed by the talent they witnessed. They were moved by it. And that's when Richard Sterling realized something he had never expected. He wasn't the center of the room anymore. He wasn't the one everyone was looking at. He wasn't the one they were applauding. Ava had taken control without lifting a finger in anger. She hadn't fought back. She hadn't raised her voice. She had simply used her talent to silence him and everyone else in the room. Ava didn't smile. She didn't bow. She didn't seek approval. She set the tray down with calm precision, her movements graceful and unhurried, without acknowledging the applause, without even a glance at the man who had orchestrated this. She turned and walked away. The applause swelled, but it didn't reach her. She was already gone, leaving Richard with nothing but a growing sense of unease. The applause eventually died down, but the impact lingered in the air like a dense fog. The clinking of glasses resumed, but there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Richard Sterling's world, once dominated by power and wealth, had been briefly, but decisively, upended. The woman who had worked at Monroe's Prime for 3 years, a waitress who, in his mind, existed only to serve, had, with a single act, turned his world on its head. As the noise from the applause faded, Richard remained frowning in his seat, his fingers still wrapped around his wine glass. He was staring ahead, but his mind was far from the restaurant. His mind was caught in the echoes of that final note, the one that had rippled through the air and shattered the walls he had built around himself. He had expected humiliation, the kind of performance that would make him and his colleagues laugh. But instead, Ava had given them something else entirely. Her voice had transcended the confines of the restaurant, of her role as a mere waitress. It had become a force, something palpable and undeniable. It had moved them, not just the audience, but even him, the man who thought he could control every moment, every interaction, simply by wielding his money and influence. But now, in the silence that followed, Richard was unsure of himself. The power he had once felt so confident in seemed fragile, and it was beginning to slip through his fingers. For the first time that evening, he looked around the table where his colleagues sat, awkward and silent, their earlier smugness dissipating into thin air. The conversation had stopped, their laughter muted. There was an unspoken discomfort in the room now, a shift in the dynamics that none of them knew how to navigate. The money they had thrown around, the power they had wielded with ease, now seemed like a cheap joke. Richard had never felt so exposed. "Are you okay?" one of his colleagues finally asked, breaking the stillness. The question was pointed but hesitant, as though even the simple act of checking in on him had become a minefield. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another sip of his wine, the glass colder than he remembered. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice distant, lacking its usual conviction. He glanced toward the back of the room, where Ava had disappeared after her performance. She hadn't acknowledged the applause. She hadn't needed to, and that was the most devastating part of it all. Ava hadn't been looking for approval. She hadn't needed validation. She had simply stood her ground, and in doing so, had stripped him of his power, of the authority he thought he held over everyone in the room. Richard's mind raced, trying to come up with some way to regain control, but he couldn't, not anymore. In the back of the restaurant, Ava moved fluidly between tables, clearing glasses and collecting empty plates with practiced grace. She had done what she needed to done it for applause, not for recognition, but for herself. She had owned the moment, and as she moved, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace settle over her. The tension that had gripped her earlier in the night was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more potent. Ava had never been one to seek the spotlight. She didn't crave attention, but when she opened her mouth to sing, it wasn't about the audience seat, it was about reclaiming her power. She had no illusions about the world she lived in. She knew the weight of her place in society. She knew that people like Richard Sterling walked through life expecting to be catered to, expecting to be revered, but she also knew that her worth was not defined by those who tried to diminish her. It wasn't defined by wealth or status or the way others looked at her. Her worth was in her voice, in her ability to stand tall in the face of adversity and say, "I am here, I matter." And when she sang, she did so without asking for permission. She had nothing to prove, nothing to lose. As Ava approached the bar to refill a few glasses, an older woman sitting nearby caught her arm gently. Her touch was warm, her gaze kind. "That was beautiful, dear," she said softly. "Truly beautiful." Ava smiled, but it wasn't for the woman's compliment. It was for herself. In that moment, she realized she had done more than survive the night. She had turned it into something unforgettable. Richard, on the other hand, was still sitting motionless at his table. The room had resumed its hum, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He had thought he was untouchable. He had believed that his wealth, his power, would shield him from everything, but Ava had exposed him for what he was, a man who hid behind arrogance and privilege, too blinded by his own sense of superiority to see the true power of dignity. The irony wasn't lost on him. Ava, the woman he had dismissed as inconsequential, had made him feel small. She had reduced him to nothing more than a man who once believed that money could buy respect, but who now knew better. His wealth, his status, his influence all meant nothing in that moment. As Richard sat there, still processing the events, he realized that there was no way to take back what had just happened. The respect he had once taken for granted, taken as his due, was gone. He could try to laugh it off, but the damage had been done. Richard Sterling, the man who could silence anyone with a look, had been silenced by a waitress, and there was nothing he could do to change that. The restaurant was quieter now, but the tension lingered, even as the night wore on, and for Richard, that tension would remain long after the doors had closed, long after he left Monroe's Prime, unable to forget the woman who had proven that true power was not measured by wealth but by the way you carried yourself in the face of disrespect. The next morning, Richard Sterling's day began as it always did. He was awake before dawn, his body moving through the familiar routine: a quick shower, a tailored suit, a polished watch, and a carefully curated image that commanded respect and attention. But as the minutes ticked by and the hours wore on, a strange feeling gnawed at him. Something was different. It wasn't just the physical sensation of his once steady confidence slipping through his fingers, but the creeping realization that he had lost something far more important: his sense of control. He had always believed that power was something you could hold in your hands, something that you could leverage to shape the world around you. But in one brief moment, it had all unraveled. Ava Monroe had changed that, not with a dramatic outburst, not with any kind of spectacle, but with a single act of defiance, a voice that had risen above the noise of the restaurant, breaking through the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. Richard had expected a meek performance, a show that would leave her humiliated, But instead, he had been the one who stood exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never allowed himself to be before. In the days that followed, Richard couldn't shake the image of Ava's face as she sang the final line of the song. It wasn't anger that she conveyed, the kind of emotion he had expected, but pity, a quiet, understated pity that seemed to settle deep into his chest, unsettling him in a way nothing else ever had. His colleagues hadn't let him forget the moment either. They had Saturday in silence for the rest of the evening, their conversations never quite returning to normal. Even the tip they had left on the table, meant to flaunt their wealth and dominance, had felt like an insult after Ava's performance. None of them had dared to address it directly, but Richard knew they had all felt the shift. They had all seen it. The following afternoon, as Richard walked through the doors of his sleek office building, he found himself battling a sense of unease that was becoming impossible to ignore. It wasn't like him to feel unsettled, but as he Saturday down at his desk and glanced over the pile of documents awaiting his attention, his thoughts wandered back to Monroe's crime. Ava's voice, the way it had commanded the room, the way it had demanded respect without asking for it. For the first time, Richard was beginning to question the very foundation of his existence, foundation that had been built on money, influence, and the belief that he could buy anything he wanted, the belief that he could break anyone who stood in his way. But Ava had stood her ground, and she hadn't needed any of his money or influence to do it. "Sterling, we need to discuss the numbers for the upcoming quarter." His assistant's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Richard looked up, forcing himself to focus on the present. "Yeah, sure, let's go over them," he replied, but his voice lacked its usual sharpness. Over the next few days, he found himself distracted. His meetings were more of a blur than usual, his mind constantly drifting back to the events at Monroe's crime. Even the most important business deals that would have once consumed him with their details didn't seem to matter anymore. It was as though the very things he had once valued, things he had once relied upon, were beginning to lose their significance. Meanwhile, Ava's life had returned to its quiet rhythm. She had been working at Monroe's Prime for 3 years, and though she'd never had any illusions about her place in the world, that night had been a turning point for her. The applause that followed her performance had been a small victory, but it wasn't what mattered to her. It was the quiet satisfaction she felt as she moved through the restaurant in the days after, her confidence unshaken. She hadn't needed the world to validate her. She had already validated herself. The truth was, Ava had never sought attention. She didn't need it. Her power lay in her ability to be herself without apology, to stand tall even when others tried to push her down. She had always known that her voice was more than just a way to entertain. It was a weapon, a force to be reckoned with. As the days passed, she couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the way people treated her. Her colleagues, the regulars, even the occasional diner, there was a new level of respect in their eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that she was more than just another face behind the bar. Richard Sterling may have thought he had humiliated her, but in truth, he had only lifted her higher. Ava had nothing to prove, but in proving that she didn't need anyone's approval to be who she was, she had earned something far more valuable than a momentary round of applause. She had earned the kind of respect that could never be bought. One evening, a familiar face approached her as she was wiping down a table. It was the older woman who had complimented her after the performance. "You know, dear," she said softly, "you have something very special. You don't need anyone's permission to shine." Ava smiled and nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She didn't need to be reminded. She already knew. For Richard, though, the truth was beginning to settle in. He had always believed that money was the key to everything, that if he had enough of it, he could bend the world to his will. But what had happened that night, in the quiet heart of Monroe's Prime, had shattered that illusion. There was a power that existed beyond wealth, beyond influence, and it was a power he couldn't control. Ava had shown him that true power was quiet. It didn't demand attention. It didn't seek validation. It simply existed, and once you recognized it, you couldn't ignore it. Richard had never been one to dwell on his emotions, especially not feelings of vulnerability. The momentary discomfort he had experienced at Monroe's Prime was supposed to have faded by now, swept away by his usual routines and the demanding pace of his business life. But the truth was, he couldn't shake the impact Ava's performance had on him. Every day, it lingered just beneath the surface, gnawing at him like a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. Even in his most private moments, he found himself thinking of her voice, the way it had filled the room, the way it had made him feel small. And what troubled him most was the fact that he couldn't make sense of it. Ava had turned the tables on him in a way he never expected. She hadn't fought back in any of the conventional ways. There was no shouting, no angry retort. She hadn't even tried to make him feel guilty. Instead, she had simply let her talent speak for itself, and in doing so, she had rendered him powerless. Richard had been accustomed to control, whether it was in the boardroom or at the restaurant. He had always been the one in charge. People did what he said, they followed his lead, and when they didn't, he made sure they learned their place. But Ava hadn't played by those rules. She had refused to let him diminish her, and in that refusal, she had stripped away his carefully constructed image of invulnerability. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. This was supposed to be a game he could win, but instead, it felt like he had been outplayed. And worse, couldn't quite figure out why it bothered him so much. He had faced adversaries far more formidable than Ava Monroe, people who had tried to take him down in ways that were far more direct, more destructive, but none of those confrontations had left him feeling the way she had. None of them had chipped away at the core of his self-assurance quite like this. In the following weeks, Richard tried to regain his footing. He threw himself into his work with even more intensity, closing deals, negotiating contracts, making his usual public appearances. Yet, nothing seemed to fill the hollow space inside him, the one that had been created the night Ava had sung. His wealth, his power, his success, none of it had the same meaning it once did. It was as though the things that had defined him had lost their weight. Meanwhile, Ava's life continued on a steady, unremarkable course. The restaurant was bustling. The tips were decent, and she was no longer just another face in the crowd. The respect she had earned after that night was palpable. People spoke to her differently, treated her with a new level of consideration. She didn't ask for it, nor did she seek it, but she had learned to appreciate it all the same. There was a quiet power in walking through life without the need for constant validation. But Ava wasn't focused on those changes. Her thoughts, too, were consumed by the night of the performance, but for very different reasons. She had known all along that she possessed a unique gift, but it had never been about proving it to anyone. She didn't want to be seen as the girl with the golden voice, the entertainer who lived for applause. What had mattered that night was reclaiming something far more important than recognition or dignity. Richard Sterling had tried to strip that away, and in doing so, he had made her realize just how much power she held. She didn't need to fight him, didn't need to tear him down. Her strength had come from the quiet act of standing tall in the face of his mockery, of refusing to let his arrogance define her. Ava knew that Richard wasn't a man who would easily let this go. Men like him didn't take kindly to being bested by someone they considered beneath them. But she didn't care about that. She was no longer concerned with how he would react, no longer concerned with his world of wealth and influence. She had found her own power, and it wasn't bound to the expectations of people like him. Richard, on the other hand, was beginning to realize that his battle with Ava Monroe was far from over. It wasn't just about proving who had more money, who had more status. It had become something more personal, a matter of pride and ego. He couldn't let this go, not after everything he had built, not after being humbled in front of so many people. He began to take a closer look at his life, his decisions, and the people he had surrounded himself with. The reality was slowly dawning on him. No amount of wealth could shield him from the consequences of his actions. People who had once bent to his will, who had catered to his every demand, were now starting to look at him with something else, as something he had never experienced before: disdain. Even in his own office, his employees seemed to avoid making eye contact with him, their conversations more strained, their movements more calculated. Richard had spent years crafting an empire built on respect to the illusion of it, but now that illusion was starting to crack. One afternoon, his assistant entered his office with a stack of papers in her hands. "Mr. Sterling, we need to discuss the upcoming charity gala. Your presence has been confirmed, and we should finalize the details," she said. But Richard wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the thoughts that had been haunting him, the truth he had been trying to ignore. It wasn't about the gala, or the meetings, or the deals. It was about Ava Monroe, and the way she had shown him just how fragile his empire really was. As he Saturday in his office, the weight of everything that had happened began to sink in. The world he had created, the world he had relied on, was slipping through his fingers, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to regain control. Richard's days had become a blur. He moved through them with mechanical precision, but the fire that had once driven him, hunger for power, control, and the illusion of invincibility, had dulled. His wealth was still abundant, his empire still vast, but none of it felt real anymore. None of it brought him the satisfaction it once had, and in the quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that someone, had changed him. Someone had brought him to a point of reckoning. Ava's voice, way it had commanded the room that night, had done something to him. It wasn't just the performance. It was the truth behind it, the quiet strength that emanated from her, the way she stood in defiance without saying a word. Richard had spent his life building a fortress around his ego, surrounding himself with yes men and sycophants who reinforced his beliefs about power and respect. But that night, Ava had torn through his fortress with nothing more than a song, and now he couldn't rebuild it. The days following the dinner had been full of distractions, but none of them could shake the image of Ava Monroe's face as she sang. He had thought it was all just a joke, a moment of entertainment for his own amusement, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that she hadn't been performing for him. She had been performing for herself. Ava had needed validation from him. She hadn't been playing the game he thought they were playing. She had simply risen above him, above his insults, above his attempts to belittle her, and let her own dignity and talent speak louder than any power he thought he wielded. Richard couldn't help but feel like a fool. And it wasn't just the guilt that gnawed at him. It was the realization that this feeling of insignificance wasn't something he could escape. He had spent decades building a reputation, making sure everyone knew his name and feared his presence. He had climbed to the top of the business world, to ruthless tactics and manipulation, and no one had ever questioned his authority. But now, for the first time in his life, he was questioning himself. He found himself returning to Monroe's Prime more frequently, not to enjoy a meal or to make deals, but to watch Ava. He couldn't explain why. It wasn't as if he was trying to relive the night she had sung. He wasn't even sure he wanted to confront her, but there was something magnetic about her presence. Every time he saw her, it reminded him of the power he had lost, and the sense of control that had slipped from his grasp. Ava, of course, was unaware of his frequent visits. She continued working her shifts, continuing to serve food and drinks with the same quiet grace she always had. But internally, she knew something had shifted. The respect she had earned was no longer just an external change. She felt it, too. It was in the way she carried herself now. It was in the way people spoke to her, the way she walked through the restaurant, as if she were a part of something much larger than herself. But there was a quiet confidence that she wasn't fully aware of before Aoni, that came from the recognition that she was in control of her own narrative. The world around her could try to define her, could try to put her in a box, but she was no longer bound by their expectations. Her talent had risen above all of that, and in doing so, she had found a new kind of freedom. One evening, as she moved between tables, She noticed Richard sitting at his usual spot by the window. His colleagues were present, laughing and toasting, but his usual commanding presence seemed dimmed. His body language was different, more closed off, as though something inside him had cracked. Ava couldn't help but notice how out of place he seemed. Despite the extravagance of the setting, he looked like a man who was trying to hold on to something he no longer understood. It was a feeling Ava had come to know, well, discomfort, self-doubt, the sensation that the world you thought you knew was slipping away. Later that night, when Ava's shift ended, she walked to the back of the restaurant to retrieve her coat. The door to the manager's office was open, and she heard snippets of conversation from within. The manager was speaking with someone on the phone, and the words Richard Sterling caught her attention. She paused, waiting for the conversation to unfold. "Not the same, is he?" the manager was saying, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You can see it, you can feel it. The guy who came in last week, who treated us all like we were invisible, is gone." Ava's heart skipped a beat. Richard Sterling, the man who had tried to belittle her so effortlessly, was being discussed in hushed tones like an object of pity. It wasn't the type of conversation she had ever imagined hearing, especially not about him. But it wasn't just the sympathy that struck her, it was the way the power had shifted. Richard had spent his life building his identity around domination, around forcing people to fall in line, but in the end, he had been outshone by something much more powerful than money or status: dignity. Ava smiled softly to herself as she slipped on her coat and walked out the back door into the cool night air. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to acknowledge Richard's presence anymore. The power had already shifted. In the end, it was not the wealth or the position that had defined her. It was the strength she had shown in the face of humiliation, and the way she had claimed her space without asking for permission.